Um, well, as Jose said, this is a new series we're starting because a lot of the books people find to be quite dense and difficult, and yet they want to come to Integral and they want to participate. So how do we get this information out there? So we thought what we're going to do is just take some selected books each month and review them. So if you want to read the book, we'll put it out a month ahead of time so you know, but you don't have to. So I'm going to tell you a lot about it, and then you can decide whether you want to read it. The one we're starting with is an unusual book. In some ways, you're not going to find a lot of his theory in here. It's a very spiritually oriented book. So it takes, a lot of his work is much more map making and philosophy and things like that. This one is much more centered in spirituality and psychology. So I just want you to know that it's quite different from a lot of his books. But we thought we'd start with it because it's an early book and it's been a lasting book. It's been published over and over and over again in multiple languages, and people tend to love it. So, and it's also a spiritual community here, so we thought we would start with that one. So the name of the book is No Boundary: Eastern and Western Approaches to Personal Growth. Okay, so this is Ken Wilber. He was born in 1949. He just had his birthday, actually, on January 31st. He was in Duke. He was doing a pre-med. He was actually in a master's program of biochemistry, and he dropped out. He wrote his first book, Spectrum of Consciousness, in 1973, when he was 23 years old, which is an absolutely astounding thing. It put him on the map. People, serious philosophers took note, got interested in him. He was washing dishes during that time. That was his job. He would go write and wash dishes. 1983, he married Terry Killam. Her name was later changed to Treya. And just a few weeks after they got married, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. So he spent years caring for her. He also, in 1986, became very, very ill himself. So there are large gaps in his writing. He's still ill today, although somewhat better. There are large gaps when he really couldn't do anything, or when he was caring for her. So you'll see that his books tend to go in, like 8 of them in 5 years, and then there's a 5-year gap, and then another group. He had several different stages of his thought, which is a very integral thing. He came across new information. He broadened what he was thinking. He didn't stick to one idea. So there are 5 different stages of his thinking. There's Wilber 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm just going to run through them. We're not going to go into detail because it's kind of complex, the varieties of things that he gets into in each one of them. But I just wanted you to know that, because this book comes from Wilber 1. So it's his early thought. He has changed a number of things that the way he thinks about them have changed in this book, and I'll kind of point them out when we get there. So the early approach was kind of a Jungian, Freudian approach that presumed that consciousness developed from a ground of being, or a collective unconscious, and then split into dualities at every stage of growth. And that's what this book is about, splitting into dualities, so we'll get into that. The idea was that to attain ultimate consciousness, or non-dual, or whatever you want to call it, you need to find the unifying ground between all these dualities and regress into the collective unconscious state of birth. Now, he doesn't believe that anymore. It's shifted because I'll explain in a minute. So no boundaries from this era. How later he sees there's what he calls a pre-trance fallacy, which is pre-consciousness, which is the infant consciousness, and then a trance consciousness, which would be the consciousness of an advanced meditator, for example. But that means we start as babies, we grow into this consciousness that we have now, this mental capacity to manage the world, this individual self. And then we begin to drop that and move into this trance consciousness. And so what he would say now is we don't regress to infant consciousness, we progress beyond that. And we have this deep consciousness, but it also comes with this capacity for mental consciousness as well, which the infant doesn't have. So then he starts with Wilber 2, which lasted for about 3 years. And this is an evolutionary developmental model. His idea is that the world is always evolving. It's going somewhere. We are evolving. We are going somewhere. We are constantly developing ourselves and growing ourselves. So his model is a model of growth, of human growth. He based it on Sri Aurobindo. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. And Mahayana Buddhism. He was a Buddhist practitioner, and he brings in the ideas of involution and evolution. Evolution, as we all know, is starting from the less conscious and moving up to a greater consciousness. But involution is when greater consciousness comes down into the world. So he looks at these two movements. In Wilber 3, for 4 years, he wrote about the levels and the lines of development. And that's something actually we're not going to get very much into in this, but that's very, very central to his theory, is the theory of the stages of growth, that we all start at a certain level of growth, which is a kind of archaic, hive-like, not very defined self kind of growth, move into autonomy, recognition of the self. Then we move into the development of this subtle rational consciousness, and then we move beyond that into causal consciousness and then non-dual. And he uses the theory of holons. The holon is a whole thing which is nested inside another whole thing. So an atom is a holon within a molecule, and a molecule is another whole thing which is inside a cell, which is another whole thing. So everything is part of something larger, but is also a whole in itself. So that's just to mention that. Okay, Wilber 4, he wrote Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. This is his largest tome, kind of the biggest statement of his philosophy. It's some 800 and something pages. And it goes into, this is when he introduces the Aqua model, which is all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, and all types. He has 5 major models that we look at in this gathering. The big 3 is truth, beauty, and goodness. So he brings that into his work, and then he talks about the 4 quadrants, which are a way of dividing up the world so that we can look at it and analyze it. And I don't know, I'll just mention it briefly. Can I go over here? We're taping this so we can put it on the website, ideally, and then people can refer back to it. Okay, so we have 4 quadrants. This side is inner, and this side is outer, and this side is individual, and this one is collective. So if we want to look at a problem like politics or health or something like that, we can do it looking in 4 different ways. One of them is through our internal experience. So I'm dealing with a political situation and I find myself getting angry or worked up or something like that. That's an inner individual experience. Then I can see what's actually going on. What are the facts? I'm watching some event on television, but I can find out what actually happened. Somebody said something, somebody did something, something happened. That's the individual outer objective. And then we can look at what kind of system is this in? We have a system of government and all this is happening within this system. We have a system of education and things like that. So we can look at this particular issue through that lens. Or we can look at the interior collective, which is our shared values and assumptions. So how does this particular event play out in our culture, in our cultural assumptions and ways of being? So that's what he introduced. And we won't see a lot of that here today, but I just wanted to mention it because it's key. All right, so Wilber 5 now is a post-metaphysical model. He's moved into a very practical way of looking at the world. A lot of his latest books have to do with business, sociology, things like that. He wrote a book called Trump in a Post-Truth World. integral meditation. How do we actually behave in this world? How do we act? So he's really focused on a lot of that lately. So this is just a list of his books, and we obviously can't read it probably, but I highlighted the ones that I think are key to read if you're going to read Wilber. So we can come back to this at the end if anybody wants to take them down or something like that. But Now Boundary, as you can see, is his second book. We don't talk about his first book a lot because his model has changed so much. And so reading that one is kind of confusing in terms of what he's doing now. So I don't tend to recommend the first one. This one, because this one establishes spiritual world in a sense, the way he sees spirit. And then there's Quantum Questions, which I think we might do, which is a book on physicists writing about mysticism. And then he wrote a book called Grace and Grit, which is about his experience with his wife. And I think we'll probably do that one here. It's an approachable way because there's such a moving story, and his theory comes into it as well. So anyway, there's some other. Integral Psychology is another important one. If you like to listen, Cosmic Consciousness is an audio. The Religion of Tomorrow, his second most recent book, I think. Another huge tome, very interesting. Integral Spirituality and Integral Life Practice he wrote with Terry Patton, who has come here a couple of times and given talks. Terry's a major integral figure. Anyway, so that's a little bit about what he does. So this book is his second book. He wrote it at the age of 29. It's been an enduring book about spirituality and psychology. And he talks about therapies as they relate to the map of human consciousness. So depending on where we are in consciousness, we are going to want to use different kinds of psychological therapies. He's against the idea that one therapy fits all. So the essential thesis of this book is what he says here. He says the ultimate metaphysical secret, if we dare state it so simply, is that there are no boundaries in the universe. Boundaries are illusions, products not of reality, but of the way we map and edit reality. And while it is fine to map out the territory, it is fatal to confuse the two. So I want to read a little quote here. Speak up? Okay, all right. So this is where we are going. He quotes somebody called Traherne. The dust and the stones of the street were as precious as gold. The gates were at first the ends of the world. The green trees, when I saw them first through one of the great gates, transported and ravished me. Boys and girls tumbling in the street and playing were moving jewels. I knew not that they were born or should die, but all things abided eternally as they were in their proper places. Eternity was manifest in the light of day. So that's the non-dual experience that someone is writing about. So he says the question, who are you? How we answer that. So we might answer it in many ways. We might say I'm a woman, I'm 71 years old, I'm an attorney, I'm whatever I am. This is the way we would define ourselves. But every time I define myself, I'm drawing a line between what is me and what is not me. So if I say I'm a woman, now I've cut out the world of men. And if I say I'm a certain age, I've cut out all of the other ages. So I've defined myself narrowly. So it means, where do I draw this boundary between me and other things? I can say I'm a body, which means I'm drawing a line between my body, my skin is sort of the boundary, and the rest of the world. So keep in mind, that's what he's talking about when he's talking about boundaries. So we have a skin boundary. We have a self-body boundary. Most of us walk around thinking we're dragging a body with us. We're a mind, and we just have this thing that comes along with us. So we've already split ourselves between mind and body. And then there's another way we split ourselves, which is persona and shadow. So, okay, so I've got this mind, But you know, I don't like everything in there. I have some really ugly thoughts sometimes. I have, you know, all this sort of memories that I don't like, and I have, you know, expectations that I don't like. So let's pretend I don't have them, because now I'll be comfortable. So I'm not angry, but where's the anger? It's out there. So I project these things that I don't like about myself, like my anger, out into the world. And so now they're angry at me. And so now I've split myself again. I don't even welcome all of me. I don't welcome the parts I don't like. I don't want them to be part of me. So now I'm reduced down to this persona, basically. I've made myself smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So another point he makes here that's important in the early chapters is speaking about opposites. And that's one of the biggest problems we get into, is we assume that everything is dual. It's binary. It's this or it's that. But he points out that all opposites share an implicit identity. So if we have the idea of hot, would we even have hot if there were no cold? It wouldn't dawn on us to have a word for hot if there were no cold. It would just be what our particular temperature was. So we wouldn't even define it. And the same thing with up and down. If there were no down, there would be no up. We wouldn't have to put a word on these things, because it would just be, I suppose, like the air. But of course we have air and no air. We have vacuum. We're just the opposite of air. So we're always going around finding these opposites, and we're drawing lines between them, which is great for analysis. It's great because we're trying to look at something and understand it, and we draw a line and we work with it. But, and he says it's also, we have two ways of approaching the same process. It's like the crest and trough of a wave. Everything is part of the wave. Hot and cold, they're all temperature. That's the wave, is temperature. Well, I mean, that's the ocean. But one wave is hot and one wave is cold. So we distinguish them, even though they're part of the same thing. He said this shows up in Gestalt Therapy, which points out that I'm only aware of something except in relation to a contrasting background. So if everything was the same color as that wall in here, it would be very hard to see it. So the fact that there's something different behind it allows me to see what's in front. He says also physics shows this, that we have waves and particles, and we have subject and object, and we have time and space, but they're all relative to each other. Quantum physics turned around a lot of our thinking about how certain and boxed in and individual the world is. So he says this goal of separating the opposites and then clinging to or pursuing the positive halves, which is what we tend to do. Good and evil, don't show me evil, I just want good. Seems to be a distinguishing characteristic of progressive Western civilization. It's religion, science, medicine, and industry. Progress, after all, is simply progress toward the positive and away from the negative. This actually creates unhappiness, because the very urge to progress implies a discontent with the present state of affairs. And he says that's our fundamental problem here. We run away from the present. We're always trying to go somewhere else other than the present. Now he says a line does not equal a boundary. And he points out that if you draw a concave line, you're also drawing a convex line. So they share this line. Convex is one side, concave is the other side. But they share the line. They're not separate in that sense. But when we take one away and say there's only concave, how can we do that? We can't do that. And he points out that all lines are like that. And you can draw the line and everything is sitting there and it's all one thing. But as soon as you try to take one away, now you've got a situation which is actually unreal. So we do that to sort and classify things, but he said, remember, the map is not the territory. We love to make maps of one sort or another. Now he says, when we are freed from the pairs, then we are enlightened, essentially. So he says, when the opposites are realized to be one, discord melts into concord, battles become dances, and old enemies become lovers. We are then in a position to make friends with all of our universe, and not just one half of it. So liberation, in the sense of enlightenment, is not good versus evil, but it's beyond good and evil. It's taking them all together in one thing. Not life against death, but a center of awareness that transcends both. And I'm reading quotes because I can't tell you in the same way that he or some of these quotes in here can do. So there's a little quote here from the Bhagavad Gita. Content with getting what arrives of itself, passed beyond the pairs, free from envy, not attached to success nor failure, even acting he is not bound. He is to be recognized as eternally free, who neither loathes nor craves, for he that is freed from the pairs is easily freed from conflict. So he points out that drawing these boundaries, we immediately have a battle, one against the other. As soon as we split the world into two, we have one thing that is better than the other thing in our minds. Instead of the whole, we're seeing the parts. And I think there was another quote. What was that? No, I think I'll skip that one. So here he says, boundary is a battle line. So we create a boundary in ourselves. When we separate ourselves from our environment, now the environment is threatening. It's something that could hurt us. We're different from that. So if we're different from that, now we've got kind of some wariness, some tension in us about the whole thing. And now if we split ourselves between our mind and our body, we've also got some tension. My body wants this, my mind wants that. We want to be able to integrate those. And then we go further and we split ourselves between persona and shadow. And so now we have a self-image that we're trying to defend, and we don't want anything else to come in. So there's even more tension. So the more we split ourselves away from this whole, the more tension we find ourselves in. So he talks about therapies for these different levels and how we can bring ourselves back. And I'm going to go through some of those later. So he says conventional psychology tends to heal this conscious-unconscious boundary, this persona and shadow boundary. Humanism heals the body-ego boundary. It brings the body and the mind into a coherent whole. And then you have to go to the traditions usually to find answers to the me and the universe boundary and to deal with that. So, chapter 3, he talks about this no boundary territory. What is it? So he talks about, again, the battle lines. When you draw a boundary to control something, I want to put my horses in this pasture. You gain, or I want to put I have this company and we have this information and it's ours and we put them in here. You gain technological and political power, but you also gain alienation, fragmentation, and conflict. So he talks about how we got here. He says Adam and Aristotle named things. They named things. In fact, Aristotle named things so incredibly well that I think it took millennia before people even began to question his naming of things. Then we learned how to measure. We learned how to count things. So now we have classes of things. So we're a little further away from reality. First we named something. When you give something a name, you start to look at the name instead of the thing. So if I hear tree, I think I know what a tree looks like. So I don't actually look sometimes at that particular tree. I'm walking around with tree in my head as a word. But then if I can talk about 50 trees, I'm even further away. Now it's just some sort of odd concept of these 50 things. And then we can move to a next level, a meta-abstraction, which is algebra, which allows abstract relations which lead to theories, laws, and principles. So now we believe our theories, our laws, and our principles, and we think the world runs according to them. We aren't actually looking at the world anymore, we're just looking at our theories. So he says man gained control over nature, but only by radically separating himself from it. Now he says quantum mechanics came along and actually upset this whole view of reality. He said between 1905 and 1925 we had a whole rush of advancements in physics. Einstein's relativity principle was one, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was another. Henry Stapp said, an elementary particle is not an independently existing, unanalyzable entity. It is, in essence, a set of relationships that reach outward to other things. So there is no building block. We keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we wanted to find the building block of nature. Well, we get down there, and there's nothing there. It's only a set of relationships. You can't measure where an electron is because it's got a tendency to exist in multiple places. And so all of these things are related. They're relationships. The universe is a set of relationships, not a set of things bouncing into each other. He said scientists develop laws governing separate things only to discover that separate things don't exist. But that is not the same thing as subjective idealism. The world is not a product of our imaginations. It's only the boundaries that we draw. There's actually something there. But it's not necessarily what we think it is. It's not 50 trees. You know, it's a real thing. It's not a product of our imaginations, although the observer, as they discovered in physics as well, affects the experiment. So however we see is determined by us. Because I will look at that scene out there and see different things because of my experience of Sedona and my idea of what a hill should look like and whether I'm interested in the light or the trees or whatever. Any one of you would look at exactly the same thing and probably see it differently, even though the same thing is actually there. So, another quote. But where? Oh, here we go. This is from Teilhard de Chardin. Considered in its concrete reality, the stuff of the universe cannot divide itself, but as a kind of gigantic atom, it forms in its totality the only real indivisible. The farther and more deeply we penetrate into matter by means of increasingly powerful methods, the more we are confounded by the interdependence of its parts. It is impossible to cut into this network, to isolate a portion without it becoming frayed and unraveled at all its edges. So we have all grown up with this idea of this separate particled universe. And actually, it's not true. And I'm often wondering what children growing up today who are going to see things very, very differently. What will they be like when they're my age, and how will they see the world? I don't know. In Buddhism, thinking and thinging are the same thing. So you think about something and you make it into a thing, reification. And he says, they talk about the void, but the void does not mean a vacuum, it just means the lack of boundaries. So when you look out, as he said, you never see a boundary, you just see a richly textured field. I'm seeing everything in here, all at once. Now, I could pick out one person, and I can concentrate and say, pretend I'm only seeing Fred. But I'm actually not. I'm seeing everybody else at the same time. So the field is always there. I've always got all of this going on, even though I've isolated one thing and said I'm going to pay attention to it. So chapter 4, he talks about what is this no boundary awareness. Unity consciousness is the term he uses for ultimate consciousness, is a state which acknowledges this reality. He points out that our language is a language of boundaries. We cannot use language to describe this state because everything in our language is foregrounding something and backgrounding something else. We're immediately in duality. As soon as we speak, we're saying this, but we're not saying that. So we've got two things. That's how language works. It contrasts things. It distinguishes things from the background. But he said no boundary awareness is a direct, immediate, and non-verbal awareness. In no boundary awareness, the sense of self expands to include everything once thought to be not self. In other words, one becomes the universe, and he will show us as we go through here how that happens. But we fortify this self. And all of our boundaries depend on that. Everything that we do, everything we think depends on me. I'm here, me, and that out there is something else. And he said, no, we don't want to destroy this ego self, because that just maintains the illusion that there is one. So we just look for the boundary. Where are we drawing these boundaries? That's what our practice is look for these boundaries. We have a separate self, experiencer and feeler in here, set apart from experiences and feelings. And if you start looking for who this feeler and hearer and seer is, you can't find him. That's unity consciousness, is to constantly practice looking for this separate self and gradually realizing you're not going to find it. He says, is there ever a seer without seeing or seen? So if I say I see a table, all of those exist at once. The act of seeing, the table, me. They're all, he says, part of one concept. He said it'd be like the stream streaming the stream. You know, it's really all one thing, but we tend to divide it up. And getting this out of our minds is well nigh impossible. I mean, it's really difficult because that's how we think. And he says also unity consciousness is not a loss of sensibilities. It's not that you blank out. You don't go into a trance, and you don't merge with everything. So what happens is that the self in here will be seen to be the same sensation as world out there. And I want to just read a little piece, and we'll turn it into a little meditation. And just so you can see if you can get a feel for some of this. So, if you'd all like to just close your eyes and sit comfortably. So he said, let's begin with a sense of hearing. Close your eyes and attend to the actual process of hearing. Notice all the odd sounds floating around. Birds singing, cars rumbling, crickets chirping, kids laughing, TV blaring, air conditioning going, my voice. But with all those sounds, notice that there is one thing which you cannot hear, no matter how carefully you attend to every sound. You cannot hear the hearer. That is, in addition to these sounds, you cannot hear a hearer of those sounds. You cannot hear a hearer because there isn't one. What you have been taught to call a hearer is actually just the experience of hearing itself. And you don't hear hearing. In reality, there is just a stream of sounds, and that stream is not split into a subject and an object. There's no boundary here. If you let the sensation of being a hearer inside the skull dissolve into hearing itself, you might find yourself merging with the entire world of outside sounds. As one Zen master exclaimed upon his enlightenment, when I heard the temple bell ring, suddenly there was no bell and no I, just the ringing. So, I don't know if that gave you a little taste of what he's trying to get us to see. And we'll do another little experiment later. So, this next chapter is about time, and I found it really the most fascinating in the book. This is chapter 5. If you only read this, I think it's worth reading. He talks about this ultimate reality, this consciousness, as without time. Because he says past and future are also only other boundaries. What we think of is this little self who has a past and has a future, this little man inside us or a little woman inside us, is composed entirely of memories. If we had no memories, there would be no individual self. How would you know yourself if you didn't have all your memories? But memory is only a present experience. You're never actually in the past, you're never in the future, you're only in the present. You have memories of the past and you have expectations about the future, but you're only actually in the present. Now, people tend to think of the present moment as this moment as opposed to that past moment and that future moment. Like we're living in this moment as not that one or not that one. That's what he calls nunc fluens, the flowing moment. It's a short present moment and it's bounded by the other moments. So once again, we've got boundaries. This moment is not the same as that moment or that moment. But there's another kind of presence. There's another kind of now, which is the eternal present, and everything resides in it. You're not pushed from the past, you're not pulled toward the future. This is unity consciousness. You essentially don't have any past or future acting on you. It is you're all now. Meister Eckhart, there's a quote there is no greater obstacle to God or unity consciousness than time. And Wittgenstein said eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. So trying to get a sense of this, we're going to do a little exercise with this one too, I think, of this idea of no past and no future, and all of everything within the present. Then you can, in a sense, sort of sit there. There's no need to be afraid of the past or of the future. It's not everlasting time. It's not time that goes on forever. It's totally without time. It can only be found now. So once you get there, you have no past guilt. And you have no anxiety for the future. Because there's no problem in the present. If you're right in this moment, there's nothing wrong. The only thing that's wrong is, oh God, why did I speak to that person in that tone of voice? I didn't mean to. That's what you think of as past, but it's a present experience, but it's a memory. And memory is one of our biggest problems. Or you're sitting there thinking, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. I made 2 appointments this afternoon at the same time. I have to go home. I have to do something. I have to change. So you can rid yourself of this past guilt and future anxiety by living entirely in this timeless moment. And it's being totally absorbed. So you know if you're doing something, like say you're drawing a picture or you're totally focused, there's somebody, like your child is talking to you and they're very upset or something, and you're totally focused in that moment. That's the kind of now we're talking about. There's nothing else going on except that exact moment in time, which includes everything else. So when you're talking to your daughter, you know the history of your daughter, you know your feelings about your daughter, you know everything. It's all present, but it's all right now. So also if you look at now and realize it had no beginning, when did now start? And when does now end? It has no beginning. It has no end. It's always there. So as I say these words, we're in now, and as I say these words, we're in now. And there's no beginning or end to any of those nows. So he calls it the unborn and the undying. That's where these words, you see these spiritual words, and as you read something like this, they tend to make some sense. You can get some sense of what they're saying. So he said, but you can't try to contact the present moment, because if you're trying to contact the present moment, it assumes you're not in it now. But you are. So let's try another little experiment here. Is this really off the wall? I mean, is this impossible? I don't want to scare everybody off integral, because we don't do this sort of thing very often. Okay, so So let's close our eyes again and try another one. Let us begin with our senses. Do we ever sense time? That is, do we ever directly sense a past or a future? Start again with hearing. For the moment, concentrate your attention on just your auditory field and notice the flux of sounds kaleidoscoping through your awareness. You might be able to hear people talking, dogs barking, kids playing, perhaps wind blowing, rain splashing, faucet dripping. Maybe you can hear the house creaking or cars honking or someone laughing. But notice, all these sounds are present sounds. You cannot hear past sounds, nor can you hear future sounds. The only thing you ever hear is the present. You do not and cannot hear a past or a future. Just as all sounds are only present sounds, so all tastes are only present tastes. All smells are present smells, and all sights are present sights. You cannot touch, see, or feel anything resembling a past or a future. In other words, in your direct and immediate awareness, there is no time, no past, no future, only an endlessly changing present, shorter than a millisecond, yet never coming to an end. All direct awareness is timeless awareness. So that's another little look at time. And it takes a lot to get this, people study spirituality for decades too. So this is the main diagram that he does in this particular volume and in his previous one. He doesn't use this anymore. He shows the person becoming awake and enlightened as going down into the depths, as it were. All of his charts that are used nowadays go up. So you would need to flip this over, and it's also somewhat different. So he doesn't use this graph anymore, but he does in this book, so we're going to go over it. So you can see the persona level where most people are. They've got a persona, they've got a self-image that they like, and then they've got... That's the light? Okay. Yeah. All right. So most people in the world are here. They've got a part of them they like, and then they've got this part of them that they actually can't even see. And we've seen plenty of other people just blind to their own behavior and things like that. Well, we've all got that too. So that's where most people are. Then as you begin to take the persona and the shadow together, you develop a healthy ego. So now you're a self who's, who doesn't burst into fits of temper, in the middle of the store or something like that. You've managed to get yourself into a healthy state, and you can pretty much manage yourself. But you see yourself, your body is something separate. So once you bring your ego and your body together, you have a total organism, he calls it here. But that total organism is still separate from the environment. And then gradually, as you go through this, you bring it into unity consciousness, and you're all one. So that's the final healing, in a sense. And he talks about different therapies. So up here, okay, when you want to try to get your shadow and your persona to come together, counseling, supportive therapy, that's always useful. If you want to get the ego and the body together, he mentioned some other things, transactional analysis, psychodrama, that sort of thing. And then if you want to try to bring the ego and into the total organism, then Rogerian therapy, Gestalt therapy, logotherapy, humanistic psychology. And then, but to get down here, he pretty much goes to the religions, to the traditions, to find how to do that. And we'll go into this in a little more detail.
Where did this come from?
It's in this book, and it's in
the Spectrum of Consciousness.
It's in Spectrum of Consciousness.
Seriously, you misspelled Progoff's name on the list. I just was wondering where it came from.
Isn't that the correct one?
Progoff? Progoff. He's did the journal.
I thought it was Progroff. No?
It's always been Progoff since I've
Okay.
known him.
All right.
You
Okay.
do typos all the
I read
time.
his book,
No,
but I
no,
don't.
this is perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever it is. Well, it was his. He did it. All right. So the growth of the boundaries. This is the restricted self. It's actually the unnatural self. This self that we find ourselves hemmed in with all these boundaries is actually not the natural self. This is the primary boundary, the one that was at the bottom there, the one between us and everything else, is between the seer and the seen, the knower and the known, subject and object, organism and environment. That's our first big boundary. Actually, he says later in the book, if we heal that one, we almost don't have to worry so much about the others, although he's changed his mind on that too. He said, then we are no longer are the world, we're facing the world. And with that comes the fear of death and a refusal to live without a future, because if you live just in the present moment, and that's everything, you don't have a future, but we don't want to give up a future. We're tied to this idea of future. And that generates an intense sense of time, because there's now, and there was then, and there's what's coming up. And we live, most of our time, we don't live in now. We live it in the future. We're planning what we're going to do, or we live it in the past. We're mushing over what's already happened. So we're actually missing now. Most of these moments go by and we don't even, I can look back on my life and I've missed whole chunks of time because I've been in my head thinking about the past or thinking about the future. I haven't actually been present to my life. So we get this sensation of time. And now we are rushing forward. In this culture, we tend to think of the past as behind us and to the left, and the future as in front of us and to the right. So the past is behind, the future is in front. And probably because he said read from left to right, we're moving that way. So, all right, so now once we draw that boundary between ourselves and the environment, we're now living in the total organism, which he calls the centaur. He dropped that terminology as well, but that's in his earlier books. So now the centaur, who is this total self, pushes away everything that reminds him of death, such as the body, because the body's impermanent. Oh my God, it's going to die. So let's not spend a lot of time thinking about that. But concepts and symbols and ideas, they seem permanent and fixed. They go on forever, right? So we begin to center our identity around an idea of ourselves. Oh, this is who Lynn is. Oh, okay, I get it. I've got, got her down now. And that's my ego. I've got this idea of me, and we call that the ego. But we lose touch with the unity of mind and body. So now we have the body versus the souls. So if we're the total, if we are the ego, and then there's this soul, we now have a soul and we have an ego. But that's still kind of a loose self-image. We still know our strengths and our weaknesses. We have emotions. We have a conscience. We have a philosophy. And if we've got a healthy ego, we're harmonizing all of those. But then, a fear of certain parts. Now he's taking us back the other direction, away from unity consciousness. Now a fear of certain parts of us arises, and we project them outside, all the negatives. I don't want to think about evil. I don't want to think about death. I don't want to think about how I wasn't very nice to the woman in the grocery store. I don't want to think about any of those things. So they're going to go out there. So now we don't have an accurate self-image anymore. We have what's called a persona. So all of the unacceptable aspects of our ego now appear external, foreign, and not self. They're projected out as the shadow. And this menacing, not self, grows and grows and grows. It gets bigger and bigger. It's not just the environment anymore. And it's not just my body, it's now everything about me that I don't like is out there. And I got to protect myself about it. Right. So I want to control everything. God forbid this thought should come in, or God forbid this person would be part of my life, or anything like that. But the importance of shadow work he brings up here, and we've done a few sessions on shadow work in this, which is really, really interesting. That converts enemies into friends, wars into dances, and battles into plays. So, as we want to reclaim this self that we have taken ourselves away from, we can work our way back by dissolving the boundaries and re-owning the projections. And he said this all starts with a certain dissatisfaction with life. Is this all there is? This isn't, there's something not right here. And he says suffering is the first grace. So when you find yourself suffering over those kinds of things, actually we're beginning to awaken to deeper realities. So we've got our suffering now. It's like, oh my God, look at this world, look at me, look at everything. But to confront and understand our suffering, we say, all right, what do I do? But depending on who we ask, some people say contact God. Some people say contact your unconscious. Some people say get in touch with your body. Some people say transcend your body. So all these soul doctors, they're in disagreement. But Ken says they're not approaching it from different angles, but from different levels. As you look here, different people say different things, but they're doing it for different parts of this reclamation project. So what he does with the rest of the book is each chapter gives you an understanding of the level he's talking about, an experiential taste of that level, and then an introduction to the types of therapies available to address that level. And then at the end of each chapter, he recommends books and therapies. So it's a very practical thing. But you have to remember, everything is from 1979 or before. So, there are a few classics that stay there, but there's also a lot that's happened since 1979. So in some ways, the book is not that useful for that situation. All right, so now we want to put our persona and our shadow together, and we want to have a healthy ego. We're going to get rid of this shadow stuff. So items that bother us, upset us, repulse us, or at the other extreme, attract us, compel us, obsess us, these are usually reflections of the shadow. Because we have a dark shadow and we have a golden shadow. We might say, oh my God, look at that person, he is such an amazing leader and so articulate, and fail to recognize it in ourselves. That's the golden shadow. Or we might say, look at that person, he's just so grumpy and unpleasant with everybody, not noticing that that is also a part of ourselves. So as he said, we loathe or obsess over in others those things we loathe in ourselves or obsess over. This leads to witch hunting. Actually in a concrete way with the Salem witches, but it happens, we go hunting for the bad people. And he says the dark side, the things that we don't like about ourselves, does not mean the bad side. He makes the comment, there's a little bit of larceny in every heart. And mentions the Hebrew tradition. God himself placed this wayward, whimsical, or perverse tendency in all people at the very beginning, presumably to prevent mankind from perishing from boredom. So just think, if we were all little angels sitting around smiling at each other all day long, it'd get kind of boring. So we have a few other things that go on. So in order to reclaim this shadow, and there are many, many techniques, and this is he's not a psychologist himself, so a lot of this is just drawn from other people, and there are other sources for shadow work that can be more profound than this. But he says, allow yourself to feel depressed, anxious, rejected, bored, hurt, or embarrassed, and then translate it back to its original meaning. So make sure you're dealing with the actual emotion, because sometimes anger is actually a cover for fear or for hurt or something like that. So you track it back, what's really going on here. And then you confront the opposites in yourself. So I'm not afraid. And you bring it back to yourself and you say, yeah, I am afraid. It's just I have chosen to pay attention to my courage and not to my fear. But they're both there. And a healthy ego can embrace that. So yeah, I can be afraid. Yes, I can be courageous. They're both here. He mentioned transactional analysis, which I think was popular at the time for doing that. Now if we want to take the ego and the body and go back to the centaur, this total organism, so that now mind and body are united. He says ego consciousness is head consciousness. Most of the time we spend in our heads. The body contains a lot of rejected emotions and feelings and is also the abode of death. So, no. But he says that some people in embodied spirituality and body practices will tell you that the body is a deeper reality than the mental ego, and he said, no, it's not. It's in fact less deep, but the integration of the two is a deeper level than either. And one of the things you'll find about integral theory is all about integrating things, bringing things together in wholes, so that we don't just get ourselves lost off in one part. We begin to see the big picture. We begin to see the whole picture of everything. And here is the big picture of spirituality that he's talking about, really, about who am I and what spirituality is. But he does it in every other respect, too, with politics and business, with ecology, everything. So we need to give up this rigidity of ego control and let these deep body sensations reach the surface. We have to get to know our bodies. We have to allow them to be. And if you really get in touch with it, you can notice there's tension all over the body. You can find places in yourself, maybe your diaphragm's tense, or your jaw, or your eyes have tension. There's tension everywhere, and this is storing some kind of, maybe a desire to cry, or a fear of speaking out, or, who knows what it is. So there are exercises you can do, noticing the body, like Vipassana meditation, where you go through and notice various pieces of your body. Breathing exercises, and as you can see, meditation involves a lot of these. So meditation is very valuable, because what meditation does is it brings up all the problems. People think you go into meditation is all about, I'm just going to sit there and have this lovely, blissful time. But no, you're going to notice, I can't sit still, I can't stop thinking, my body is uncomfortable, I have tension over here. You're going to find all these things that you actually you didn't consciously know that you had. And then when you find them, great, now you get to do something with them. So, another thing he says is try to increase the tension. So you find tension in your jaw and you just try to make it tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and see what that teaches you. As I said, the exercises here are, you can find a lot more depth in probably some other works about this. Okay, so now you can accept what you can't even control about yourself. So a fit of temper, oh well, it's me. I like to think of myself as a puppy dog, which is, if I don't keep it on a leash, it's going to go out and do all kinds of, destructive or objectionable or offensive things to other people or to myself or whatever. So I think of letting the puppy be, but keeping it on a leash. It doesn't mean you go out and behave like anything goes. You still do that, but you allow that in yourself. You allow yourself to say, yes, I could chase cars, whatever, but I'm not going to. So when you get to this place, it leads to delight within, the spontaneity of the centaur, to self-actualization, autonomy, and meaning in life. And this is essentially the integral stage, as you'll find when you get into reading more about him. This self-actualization, this self-autonomy, becoming a full human being in a way, is the integral stage of development. He says to find egoic meaning in life is to do something. To find centauric meaning in life, fundamental meaning, is to find that the very processes of life itself generate joy. So it's the experience of life. It doesn't mean you don't do things, but it doesn't mean you have to do things. It doesn't mean your happiness is going to come from doing things. Happiness just comes from life. At this point, you accept impermanence, you release yourself into emptiness, and you accept death. So everything is okay. Everything is all right. Whatever it is okay. So here he suggests using Gestalt Therapy, Hatha Yoga, bioenergetic analysis, but without shunning mental egoic insight and verbalization. He makes a big point of this all the way through. A lot of people want to throw out the rational. Oh, we've had enough rational, that's why we're in trouble. And the New Age doesn't like the rational. But he said, no, we bring that along. We don't throw that out, we keep it with us. Even though we can move into more heart-centered spaces, we still have a mind and we don't let that go. So now he's talking about these transpersonal bands. I don't want to have to keep jumping back. See if I can find the diagram in here. Well, there it is. Okay. So this is the diagram you may remember. I know you can't see it, but I'll just remind you. So we've moved down from persona, shadow, ego, body, down to the total organism. Then he has these, what he calls transpersonal bands, and he's dropped all this in his later work too. But what he's meaning here is that between this integral self and unity consciousness, there are a lot of steps that we take. We move along. One of them you might notice is the witness. People have read a lot about that. The witness is the stage in between the integral and the non-dual. It's another state of consciousness. So this is getting in touch with the transcendent. We have, he says, in the West, we have repressed the transcendent. We don't want to have anything to do it. But it's been erupting all over the culture: meditation, psychic phenomena, yoga, Oriental religions, biofeedback, and a lot of things. Well, in '79, they were all new. Now they're just a huge, ordinary part of our world. Freud limited his work to the ego, persona, and shadow, just the simple levels. But Jung pushed through to the transpersonal, which is one of the reasons they broke their connection. So he found archetypes, basic symbolic forms that are housed in the collective unconsciousness. And Wilber says we need to start to live mythologically, not in terms of believing myths, but to open ourselves to this no-boundary world, not ignoring the conventional world, but re-enlivening it, finding the magic in the world, not believing in magic, but finding the magic in the world as it exists today. We want to look at the world from a universal perspective and not a personal one. So at this point, we're beginning to drop the individual person and begin to look from a larger self, which will eventually become the witness. So instead of seeing the world solely in terms of this mind, this body, and all that sort of things, begin to see it in a collective sense. What is this like for humanity? I'm a representative of humanity. It's not so much my individual self that matters, but me as part of this larger body. So he says the soul then becomes saturated with depth, lets go of personal problems and dramas, finds, haltingly at first, but then with an ever-increasing certainty, a quiet source of inner strength that persists unperturbed like the depths of the ocean, even though the surface waves of consciousness are swept with torrents of pain, anxiety, or despair. And we've probably all had moments of this. Like in a crisis, you'll find that inner strength. There'll be that calm, that sudden calm in the middle of crisis. That's that part of you. That's that unity conscious, that self that isn't swayed by everything that's going on. And eventually that can become a permanent state of being. He says, well, recognizing archetypes is not the only path to the transcendent. He talks about the exercise of the via negativa, which is where you say, I have a body, but I am not my body. I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. And you keep doing that with everything. I'm not this table, I'm not that, I'm not that. And you go back and back and back and back, which takes us to the fact that what you really are is awareness. You're just a witness of everything. That's your basic self, is just awareness. Because you can have thoughts, you can look at your thoughts, you can actually say, I see this one dancing by now. I can see what I'm saying, it's a thought. So I can witness my thoughts. So that can't be the most fundamental thing. There's something more fundamental, which is awareness, which is looking at all these thoughts. And that takes us to the witness. When we get to the witness, that's the jumping off place, he says, for the non-dual. And Jose was talking this morning in the meditation about awareness and then spiritual inquiry. And awareness is coming from this witness. And then you move to the spiritual inquiry and discover, actually, that you're not there. So Adyashanti has said something I just loved. He was being interviewed, and they said, tell us about your awakening. He said, when I awoke, I wasn't there. Which I thought was great. So the personal self tends to go kind of transparent and drop away. This can take many years. Even for people who have a sudden awakening experience, they don't lose the personal self very quickly. You still have access to it. It actually doesn't go away. You can use it. You have a body, you have a persona, you have a shadow, but they all now work in harmony. And you can choose when to use it. The same way as we get to a certain place in our lives where we can choose whether or not to express our anger. We have anger, but we're not driven by anger. We are not had by anger anymore. Now we've got anger. Sometimes it's useful, you know. We might want to bring it out. Sometimes it's not. And the same here with the whole ego self. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. So we die to the personal self so as to awaken to the transcendent self. We begin then to treat all of the environment as if it were itself. So moving into this non-dual consciousness, everything becomes the self. So it's not threatening, but it's also to be cared for. The self is to be cared for, and so is everything else. Our usual sense of I-ness, when I think of I, okay, who's I? It depends on memories and the mind and the body. But the real sense of I-ness, because you had the same I-ness when you were 5 as you have now. I think when you were 5 years old, you had a sense of I. You have a sense of I right now. It's the same sense. It's also the same sense that's in everybody else. So you begin to realize that this awareness is much larger than your individual self. So there's a quote here. But as for that inward I, indeed, what is that? It was not born with your body, nor will it perish upon death. It does not recognize time, nor cater to its distresses. It is without color, without shape, without form, without size, and yet it beholds the entire majesty before your own eyes. It sees the sun, clouds, stars, and moon, but cannot itself be seen. It hears the birds, the crickets, the singing waterfall, but cannot itself be heard. It grasps the fallen leaf, the crusted rock, the knotted branch, but cannot itself be grasped. You needn't try to see your transcendent self, which is not possible anyway. Can your eyes see itself? You need only begin by persistently dropping your false identifications with your memories, mind, body, emotions, and thoughts. So that's the process of enlightenment, is not to go for enlightenment, which people do, but is to get rid of all of the things that are in the way. So for this level, he recommends Jung, Maslow, Saggioli, Groff, people like that. You can see them in the book, he's got them. All right, so the ultimate state of consciousness, this loss of unity consciousness, which he says we all have to start with, throws us into a world of boundaries, space, time, suffering, and mortality. He said there is no path to it because it is always already present. So when we look away from present experience, this past-future thing, we are moving away from unity consciousness, because unity consciousness is the present. And every level has resistance. We resist going, we resist knowing about our shadow, we resist integrating with the body, and we resist essentially letting go of the self. So here we won't concentrate in the present, so we use thought instead of presence. I don't want to be present. Jose had an experience at a meditation retreat where he realized, even though he wasn't thinking, there was like, you know, the golf narrator. He's stepping up to the plate now. Now he's going to shoot the ball. And there's this little voice that goes on and on and on and on through our lives, narrating our lives to ourselves. So see if you can find that one. So everything is a resistance. We want to think instead of actually experiencing something. So he said, finally you realize, this idea of how can I stop moving away? Because there seems like nothing I can do, because everything I do is saying it's a duality and I've got to get there and I'm here. So often a dark night ensues once you see there's nothing you can do. So you sort of, particularly for a spiritual seeker, that's pretty desperate. What do I do now? And then you realize that everything you do is you doing it. There's always a you involved here. It's always you. You're trying to meditate. You're trying to understand this. You're trying to do that. So the separate self is the resistance. The fact of having this individual separate self is what is causing us not to be in unity consciousness. But he says certain things are expressive of unity consciousness. So by assuming the characteristics of this deeper level, as your present practice, you undermine this resistance. And this is a way to do it. In fact, Craig Hamilton has a wonderful one-year course in which he starts people out. Imagine you're enlightened. Okay, so right now we're going to work on joy. Because joy is one of the aspects of unity consciousness, and gratefulness is another one. So you just practice these things. Practice joy, practice gratefulness, practice clarity. All of those aspects will gradually become more and more a part of you. So I guess that's it. So we've got 45 minutes left to discuss this undiscussable.